I'm going to go on the record and say that if you compare the Christianization of once pagan societies to that of the colonization of the Americas, you're a fucking moron.
It's pretty brazen for somebody that can't even put the pizza down before they hit the record button. But let's see it.
The Christianization of once polytheistic and pagan societies is something that is ill understood by the public. It didn't happen overnight, and there was no pagan genocide.
This is actually part right and a little misinformed. Part right because no, it did not happen overnight. It was a very slow burn. It involved multiple heads of state becoming Christian before they forced it on their people through laws. However, it was a genocide in the most technical way because it was an erasure of culture. It was an erasure of the pagan cultures that had already existed and that were there before Christianity came in, and they would not have needed to use force if it was a peaceful transition, which is what this individual is trying to say, and they showed in their comments.
It is beyond inappropriate to misappropriate and rip indigenous talking points to spin them and make them about neo-pagan problems. It's pathetic.
While I agree that you should not appropriate the trauma and atrocities that have been thrust upon indigenous people all over the world, not just in the Americas. It is, however, a connected problem. And this person's anger, we'll get to that at the end, but it's very unjustified. So first off, it was actually Pagan Rome that started colonizing and started genociding cultures. We see this with Julius Caesar versus the Gauls. Famously had a political campaign in order to wipe them out so that they could take over their land. They did this to a lot of people. They annexed, they colonized, and they set that precedent. So whenever the Christians came in, they essentially took that ball and ran with it. As far as the pathetic part, this is something that a lot of new pagans will latch onto without knowing the history, and then this person for some reason is just latching onto something else that is also an incomplete history because they haven't done the research, they haven't decolonized, and I'll talk more about that at the end of the video.
At a glance, it may seem as though our issues are very interconnected and similar, but they're not.
That's because they are. It's because of that precedent set by Pagan Rome that eventually turned Christian Rome into what it was. And you'll see a lot of that zealotry if you look into Emperor Theodosius I. He was one of the first Christian emperors to actually sack the pagan temples, made it illegal to go inside. And then his atrocities and the atrocities of Rome in general led to that fervent zealotry that we see with Charlemagne, with the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman, murdering the Saxons whenever they came to a peace talk because Charlemagne knew that they would not come armed to that peace talk because the massacre of Verdun. And there have been many atrocities since. We actually have court records of this. And of course, laws are also violence implemented by the state. And that's something else that this person and these shitty articles that I've been seeing, like this one from the Trove, don't really seem to understand. Laws are violent. And if you disagree that laws are violent, I have some footage from some Native American protests that you may want to look at.
Here are some of the biggest points of difference. 1. You chose to be pagan. Indigenous people did not choose to be indigenous.
As far as modern paganism is concerned, yes, we chose to be pagan. However, the atrocities that happened to the pagan population in Europe back in the day, those people were born into their various types of paganism. And as John Trudell pointed out in the first rebuttal that I posted to this video, the tribes of Europe, as John Trudell points out, lost their identity and then ended up inflicting that same totalitarian, authoritarian fascism on the natives. So it is connected. A not so fun fact, the word fascism actually comes from Pagan Rome, where that colonization precedent was set. It was actually an implement they used that the philosophy of fascism comes from, and you'll still see that symbol on various things today, including a few American government symbols.
2. There are indigenous people living today that can recount the horrors of the colonization of the Americas. They have a thriving oral history that speaks to the genocide they faced because guess what? It didn't happen oh so long ago.
This is another weird thing that these revisionists do where they compare atrocities, like the atrocities that happened fairly recently are somehow worse than the atrocities that happened back in the day. It's never good to have a dick measuring contest with terrible things that have happened. That's kind of an absurd, and it really takes removing your own humanity to kind of do that. I'm not really sure why that is, to be honest. That's something about this hot take that I've dealt with on multiple platforms now that really just baffles the crap out of me.
Meanwhile, Scandinavia, Greece, Rome, Egypt, pretty much any society that had a polytheistic past, they were Christianized thousands of years ago.
Most polytheist societies are actually indigenous. You've got like the Yoruba in Africa, one of the largest ethnic groups. They're definitely polytheist. I've mentioned them in other videos. Native Americans, all the different tribes were polytheist. I actually compared some of those tribes in my Thor video. If this person were to have actually done their research instead of trying to white savior, not talk to indigenous people, instead of just attaching themselves to this weird bandwagon that's been going around the internet, they would have known that.
That is not an open wound. That is a closed wound. In fact, it's healed over.
That is not a closed wound. That is not something that does not affect us to this day. It does affect us. In fact, if you're a pagan, if you are a Reconstructionist, in this day and age, the reason you have to is because of the Christian erasure in the past. Not to mention that colonization precedent that was set back in Pagan Rome that affected the Christians, that then later affected the colonial period, and then the rest of the world. These problems still exist to this day. This has to do more with that materialist dialectic. If you were to actually do your research and look into leftist ideology instead of neoliberal screaming into the internet, you would be familiar with the materialist dialectic. This is a Marxist theory. Throughout all of history, it is the rich elite ownership class, the bourgeois, versus the working class people that actually build everything and do all the work. We see this with the pharaohs of Egypt, the billionaires of today. It is something that has always existed. The Christianization of Europe was actually a top-down kind of thing. First, the ruling class became Christian, and then they inflicted those totalitarian Machiavellian laws on the people. And that very same mentality is what affected natives all over the world. The only real difference is that race as a concept did not exist back when Christians were colonizing Europe. And they got way better at that colonization as time and generations persisted. The genocide and erasure of native and indigenous peoples was far worse because they had so much more practice, had better technology, they had better tools. Just like today, they have better tools with propaganda and changing the narrative. And that's why your conservative uncle, when you say these things to him, denies them up and down because that propaganda has gotten to him.
I don't deny that sometimes people can be rude jackasses when they find out that you're pagan, but that is absolutely incomparable to the systemic racism and intergenerational trauma faced by indigenous people today.
I agree with that.
You aren't oppressed because you're pagan, and that is especially the case for those of us that live in the Western world.
That comes from a point of privilege. And I know that because I am from California, a place where different religions are very accepted, and I currently live in Texas, where it's not so much. I have been fired from a job for trying to exercise my religious beliefs. I have seen bosses blatantly in front of me say they wouldn't hire other people for their religious beliefs. It depends on where you live. If you're in somewhere like the South, there are places in the United States where you are oppressed being pagan. You can't drive down the highway in Texas without seeing a bunch of Christian billboards. Trust me. We are a religious minority in places like this, and there are cases of oppression. I wouldn't say it's as bad as BIPOC people's face. Obviously, other than my high-speed haircut, I can pass with the general population, but that doesn't mean some oppression doesn't exist, and we call that intersectionality.
And if you continue to misappropriate Black and Indigenous talking points, I will find you.
And there it is. That shit-eating grin at the end tells us all we need to know. This person is not actually trying to educate people and dispel the racism that exists within our society. What they're trying to do is be that white savior. They want to be a hero. They want to put their white face in front of the problem, when in reality what they should be doing is listening to Black and Indigenous people of color in order to start decolonizing and deprogramming their mind. So remember, every time you see some kind of half-decent argument on the internet that you're about to agree with, Do your research. Look into it. There's always more. History is complicated. It's never that cut and dry. It's not really something you can make in a 2-minute TikTok video to make a valid point on, to be honest. We are the sum of our actions, not our words.